Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we've got one that I think is going to be very special indeed. We have got a couple of, I guess the best way to classify this grouping of beers is that they are rich ales. They're specifically ales and they're styles that are richer. Now, fully realizing that I record well in advance so I don't get behind on my beer reviews, I am recording this in the middle of winter, though I'm sure that this is going live somewhere in August of 2020. I'm recording it in winter of 2019. So it may seem, wow, you're thrown down with those in the middle of the summer. I'm not. It's winter, so these are really great choices. Nonetheless, today we're going to be jumping into a couple beers from two brewers I've never had anything from prior, so I'm very excited about that. Both of these I did get from Tavour. The first beer is going to be City Brewery's Big Magnificent Bastard. This is a Scotch barrel-aged, yes, that's right, Scotch barrel-aged Scotch ale. 9.9% ABV on this one. They are based out of Bremerton, Washington. And then number two is, and I'm sorry, I don't actually know the correct way to pronounce this. It could be Friem or it could be Friem. I don't know if it's all one word or if it's a punctuation of one letter and then the last name, but it looks like a German spelling. So it could be Friem, it could be Friem. I'm not entirely certain. But nonetheless, this beer is a winter ale and it's aptly named Winter Ale. This one clocks in at 7.5% ABV and they are based out of Hood River, Oregon. So we've got two higher ABV, big rich beer styles here, both ales, from two brewers I've never had anything from prior. So I'm really excited to jump in and we're going to do exactly that. We're going to start with the City Brewery's Big Magnificent Bastard, the Scotch barrel-aged Scotch ale that clocks in at 9.9% ABV. Okay, so jumping right in with the first beer of today's rich, hearty ale review, we've got City Brewery's Big Magnificent Bastard. This is a Scotch barrel-aged Scotch ale that clocks in at 9.9% ABV. They are based out of Bremerton, Washington. So first things first, I did see it's got a little foil wrap and clearly has a cap, but it may well have a cork. So I've got all my tools of the trade here just in case. But before we jump in, label art, you can see, is very clean design, understated. It looks very classy. Nice black with some gold kind of leaf like infill on the label. It looks very nice. Looks like they have kind of a European coat of arms stylized lion on there. Perhaps that's their brand insignia. But this beer does give you some information about it. The first thing they tell you is their hop choice, Nugget and Cascade. That's nice. Malt, they use Northwestern Pale, Munich, Black, Caramel, and peated malt. So this sounds like a really great selection for added richness and a perfect choice for a Scotch ale base, especially that peated malt, which with the Scotch barrel aging, that might impart kind of that peated Islay whiskey, which is my favorite style of all Scotch whiskey is Islay. Comes from the Islay region. It's the most heavily peated of all whiskeys, of all Scotch styles. Some others use peated malts, or smoke them over peat, but Islay, that's kind of their trade. Like they're all like that. A lot of the Glens, like Glenmorangie, Glenfiddich, a lot of those have a sweeter honey-like quality, which puts me in mind of a lot of, say, Japanese whiskeys. But the Islay is known for that peatiness. And of course, Scotch ales can have peated malts and add that kind of smoky quality to it. So I expect this malt bill is going to pair very well with this. Last few things they mentioned, IBUs are 30 and ABV I already told you 9.9. So without further ado, let's get this foil pulled off and we'll see what the situation is once we get this cap pried off, if there's a cork pull required or not. We will soon find out. All right, nope, just a little foil seal and a standard cap. So cork pull not required. All right. Let's get this beautiful, big, magnificent bastard poured right in the glass. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. That's looking just like a classic Scotch ale. That's the shade of brown that I do expect to see 99% of the time. And it is an effervescent beer style, much like porters. So it's going to form a decent head here. It's up in the air whether or not it's going to retain. I can tell you this beer has a very pronounced aroma. I can smell it from here. But before we get to that, let's hold this up. Oh yeah, this is classic Scotch ale. It's a nice dark brown. It's not dissimilar to the color of a brown ale, but just a tick lighter in terms of intensity. So it looks great, and I can absolutely see it's very active in terms of carbonation. Looks like mostly fine champagne-like bubbles, some medium-sized ones coming up, and it did form a nice creamy, lush Scotch ale head on top, though I can see a lot of activity happening here. So I expect this is going to break down before I get to the end of it, but that's not a problem. Let's get right over the glass for a sniff. Oh God, that just smells great. You can smell that malt bill, and you can smell that barrel going to work. It just smells so nice. It's got this caramel sweetness to it with a little hint of a booziness underneath. It smells very, very nice. And I can tell you, I'm not really detecting any of that peatiness in the nose. So we'll see how clearly it comes through in the actual flavor. So without further ado, let's jump right into this bad boy. Oh, that peat is front and center. Wow. You can really taste that Scotch barrel. My word. Oh, that's so nice. Now, I don't know what kind of Scotch they use for their barrel. It easily could have been an Islay. It could have been anything. And maybe that peated malt that they added is throwing me off, but boy, that really comes through strongly. This peatiness, which gives this nice smokiness to it. It's not dissimilar to Rauch beer, but it's not quite on that same level of intensity. And the other flavors that go into building a Scotch ale, particularly one that's kind of been peated, that has that smokier quality to it, it's really about the balance of what they put in. The peatiness aside and that smoky, earthy quality aside, overall, the way that this malt bill is working is a lot sweeter than your average Scotch ale. It's not quite as heavy feeling. It's not quite as caramel laden as your average Scotch ale. It's got a much sweeter, honey-like sweetness side to it. That's really what comes through in stark contrast to this intensity of the peat and the smokiness behind it. So this really, the flavor profile to me is coming off very much as a story of contrasts that work when they're put together to make the whole, like most peated Scotch ales. This one's just got a lot sweeter side to its other malts in the malt base. I'm going to jump back in for body and mouthfeel. The body is surprisingly light for a 9.99% or 9.9% ABV beer. I would say it's light. I would not even say it's medium. It's a light body. It's very light. It does not have a lot of substance. There's not a lot of weight to it. In terms of mouthfeel, it's very much a classic Scotch ale. Even though it's 9.9% ABV, you're not getting a lot of viscosity. They typically don't have that. It feels almost about the consistency of water, but very effervescent, not just like a porter. So that part is spot on. But the body surprises me how light it is for the ABV. But it feels nice. I'm going to jump back in. Actually, I'm going to top this off just a little bit more and jump in and explore this flavor development just a bit more while I think about how they develop in this balance. Up front, you're hit with this interesting mix of tasting strongly the Scotch barrels and peat and sweetness and smoke and earthiness. So it's a really big combination. And I could tell you it's a very pleasurable combination. Overall, I think the balance of it is excellent. If I had to make any kind of, and this is just my thoughts on it, I don't want to necessarily say it's a criticism, but perhaps the peated malt is in a quantity that's a bit beyond for the quantity of the other ingredients. It's not entirely in balance. But that being said, how sweet that the other malts that they chose are coming through in this beer without that underlying peatiness and earthiness and smokiness. Even with the Scotch barrel aging in there, I think it would have just come out overtly sweet and really would not have tasted like a standard Scotch ale. So I think they probably got it right there. Maybe some additional caramel malts would have helped richen it up in the middle. Then they could have backed off just a little bit of the smokiness, which would in turn help that Scotch barrel speak a little more prominently. But you do get it. It's mostly up front and it's gone. It's fleeting. It's gone in a few seconds. But when you do realize, oh my gosh, that's absolutely a Scotch barrel, a taste of Scotch, it's just tremendous. This is a very, very nice Scotch ale. I've never had a Scotch barrel-aged Scotch ale. What a genius idea. I'm a big, big fan. I'm going to jump back in for one more sip for final thoughts here. Oh, it's intense. It's intensity of flavor. It's just bam. Sweet, Scotch, peat, just full force. All melts together. There's nothing really vying for the forefront. No, I take it back. That Scotch barrel it loses its intensity within about 3 seconds, but it lingers on for at least 10 to 15. On multiple sips, I'm getting more of it. And actually, the more sips you have of this, it's kind of interesting. Normally, it works a little opposite in beers. The more sips as I'm having, the more balanced it's becoming. So the peat isn't becoming as oppressive. It's just a shock to the palate at first, and it's so intense. So get a couple sips under your belt. Take that first sip, really think on it, enjoy it, rinse it around the palate, then take another one or another two within a few minutes, and just small sips. I'm not suggesting you chug or glug it, but get a few under your belt. You really start to kind of hone in on what this beer's about, and really, I like it. I like this a lot. I like it more than I thought I would at first based on the intensity of the peated malt, because I thought, oh gosh, it's going to throw the balance off. And yeah, I see why they did what they did, and I think honestly in the grand scheme, the grand picture of the things, it is part of the reason that helps keep it balanced. I just think maybe dial back the intensity a hair on all of the malts and let that whiskey barrel speak a little more, that Scotch whiskey. I mean, that's just the jewel of this. Frankly, I love it. I'm going to take my time sipping on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's review, and that is I'm just going to say P. Friem for the time being because I don't know what it is. That's the winter ale that clocks in at 7.5% ABV. Okay, now moving on to the second beer of today's hearty, rich ale review. We have got P. Friem's Winter Ale. This one clocks in at 7.5% ABV, and they are based out of Hood River, Oregon. This will be the first beer I've ever had from P. Friem. I'm assuming it is P. Friem and not Friem, spelled as German would. They pronounce PF together with them individually, but I'm not really sure. So we're going to stick with P. Friem. If anybody knows definitively, please do let me know down in the comments. Now, starting with the label art, again, here's another one that's just got a very, very clean design, black and again with gold, so it looks quite nice. Winter Ale, again, this recording is going to be coming out probably sometime in August of 2020, but I am recording this in winter of 2019. So it is a very appropriate time of the year for these, and I absolutely love winter ales, winter beers, winter warmers, any of them. They're not brewed most of the time outside of the winter months, though they can be. They're just much harder to find, but I absolutely love them. They're typically quite bold, big, full of character, and really nice, heavier beers that really sit well during the colder months. So you get a lot more beer weight for your money. But nonetheless, let's get this cracked. We'll get this poured right in the glass here. Oh, quite a bit lighter than I was anticipating. This could be the lightest winter ale I've had to date. And I have had many over the years. Never had one this kind of blonde ale shade. Looks very nice. Yeah, that's a really, really lovely beer. Very active in terms of carbonation. Obviously, you can see it formed a very thick head here. Very active as well. A mix of kind of small and medium bubbles. That's kind of how the carbonation is going. So we'll see how long the head sticks around, but it looks fantastic. That's lush. I can see a little activity up top, so we'll see how long it sticks, but let's give this a sniff. Oh, that smells quite nice. It smells light. It smells fruity, and it smells kind of rich and caramelly. So it's got kind of an interesting aroma combination. There's these caramel undertones mixed with this light, bright fruitiness, almost honey-like, really, is what's coming through. And there is a little note of underlying sweetness to it, really coming from that kind of honey aroma. Really smells quite nice, but it's very, very malt-centric. I'm sure that there's some, well-selected hops that are in here. Could even have some classic winter ale spices. I'm not really sure. It doesn't say, but we'll find out. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Mmm. Mmm. Oh, that's a very nice beer. It's a very nice beer. Quite a bit different than your average winter ale. Quite a bit different. What I was smelling on the nose, really elements of it come through in the flavor here, but it's quite an interesting winter ale. This has a very unique malt bill that they chose. That much is clear in that there's this slight lighter fruity side to it, but it is dominated by almost equal parts this very caramelly malt characteristic and then this underlying kind of baked good characteristic. So it's kind of biscuity, toast-like. And I didn't anticipate that. With the lighter shade, it would have been a good guess, but that's very atypical for a winter ale, but it works. It's very, very nice. I don't really taste any other additives, any underlying spices. Often you'll get cinnamon, nutmeg, things of that nature, orange peel. I don't taste any of that. This just tastes like a really well-made winter ale that's all about the malt selection, and it does have a little bit of a hoppy bite to it, which is pairing really with that kind of baked good malt side that's coming through. It's very nice. It's refreshing. It's not as heavy as I expected either. 7.5, that's not a ridiculously high ABV, but it's winter ales tend to be a bit heavier than that. They tend to be darker, richer, heavier, and this is a very interesting take on the classic style. I really like it. I'm going to jump back in for body and mouthfeel and start to explore these flavors a bit more. The body is a solid medium, kind of right smack in the middle. So it feels nice. I, again, would expect it to be a little bit heavier for the style and for the ABV range, but it feels nice. It's within range of being kind of what I would anticipate, just a little lighter. The mouthfeel, quite nice. It's got a lot of viscosity to it. It definitely has a thicker mouthfeel to it, much thicker than you would anticipate for the ABV range. In tandem with that, if you do start to agitate it around the palate, boy, does it get ridiculously thick and creamy. Lush, silky creamy, not super foamy, bubbly, but just creamy, silky creamy. That's super fine, just wonderful, wonderful texture to it. In terms of where the flavor's going, this really, the more sips I have on this, it 100% is all about this malt bill that they selected here. And there is this underlying hoppiness that you can get in the back. There's underlying bitters, but it really is all about the malt bill. And I'll tell you, the hops they chose go very well with the flavors that are being produced by this malt bill. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan. It's definitely not what I expected, but I'm liking it. I'm going to top this off a bit more. I got to say the balance of it too. I like the malt selection that they made, the individual ratios is really well chosen because you get all of these different and interesting flavor characteristics, but none of them are really vying for, attention. Like you get all of them independently, and it's very well put together. It's very well balanced. I'm going to jump in one more sip here for final thoughts. That's very nice. You get that honey sweetness mixed with that caramel up front. Then a few seconds in, that baked goods side of the malt bill starts to come through, and they're all just kind of co-mingling. And within about the 5-6 second mark, that's when you start to get the underlying hop bitters. And it tastes like probably traditional noble hops, Czech German noble hops. It's nothing over the top. It's nothing funky. It could even be something as mild as, say, an English Fogel. But it's not a big, bold, high alpha acid. It's this classic kind of soft, earthy hop quality. And that pairs exceptionally well with this malt bill. It's very, very nice. Finally, in terms of length of finish, my final thoughts here, it's got a much longer finish than I would have anticipated, especially for the style. And really, I think it's the cleanness of the malt bill, just how clean it comes down and tails off, but it leaves these beautiful, earthy underlying bitters, and they're really going quite a long time, surprisingly so. It's really IPA territory in terms of length of finish based on bitters. Fantastic. I'm a big fan of this one. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked. Starting with the Silver City Brewery's Big Magnificent Bastard. This is a Scotch barrel-aged Scotch ale. Clocks in at 9.9% ABV. They are based out of Bremerton, Washington. Starting with the aroma on this beer was positively huge. It was one of those you could smell from several feet away, and it just got more intense the closer you got. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste, I really, really enjoyed this beer. Really, for me, the only thing I thought about it that you could even take as a negative knock was I thought it was missing some of the character elements that are typical in a Scotch ale malt bill. It was a little on the sweeter side, and it did offer a wonderful stark contrast to the peaty smokiness that they added with the peated malts. But still, for me, I would have liked a little richer balance in malt bill. I only docked 1 point though. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the body on this beer was not great at all. It was very light, far uncharacteristic, and certainly for a beer of almost 10% ABV, it gets a 2 out of 10. The mouthfeel, total 180 though. This was perfect Scotch ale mouthfeel. It had a nice bit of viscosity to it, that little bit of resistance, and it just felt right on the palate. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the finish on this one was quite long, especially comparative to other Scotch ales. This was far longer than the average, and really it comes back to those peated malts. The smoky, earthy, peated edge of this beer really came through and helped to extend the length of the finish. Well above average, it gets an 8 out of 10. For the head and retention, Scotch ales are kind of a crapshoot. They run the gamut. They tend to be very effervescent beer styles, and this was no exception to that. But it formed and retained a wonderful head the whole time, 10 out of 10. Appearance-wise, this was textbook Scotch ale. It was that brown shade that's just a little bit lighter on average than, say, a brown ale, lighter still than a porter. But it wasn't a light brown. It wasn't a lighter kind of golden color. It's exactly what I picture in my head when I think of a Scotch ale. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance, personally, I really enjoyed the balance on this beer, but I come back to, I would have liked maybe some richer, heartier malts in there to go along with the sweeter, lighter side. Maybe some caramel malts extra would have gone in and gone a long way to kind of balancing out a bit. And also the peat. Well, I personally enjoyed it because I'm a drinker of Islay Scotch, and that's what it immediately put me in mind of, especially in tandem with the Scotch barrel aging. I think that maybe the peat side of the beer was a bit strong. I did still think it was well above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. Filling in the intangible. Personally, I really enjoyed this beer. I've never had a Scotch barrel-aged beer, and it was really tremendous. And the Scotch barrel-aged Scotch ale, interesting combination. I mean, they don't necessarily have that much in common other than the name, but it did work. Especially with the peating, it kind of put me in mind of an Islay Scotch, which that's what I drink again. But for me, honestly, overall, I did enjoy it, but I would have liked a little less sweetness, a little more heartiness in the malt bill. And even though I'm a fan of Islay, I thought maybe the peat malt volume was a bit overbearing. Still thought it was above average, though. It gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. I didn't dock too many points in too many categories, but notably the body and just a few other little elements. It was enough that really in retrospect, I thought long and hard on this one. I am a fan of Isla's, but they're a very polarizing beer, or rather Scotch style, and just as Rauch beer, smoked beer, German smoked beer, is a very polarizing beer style. This with the peated malts, put it in that clump of beers that's very, very polarizing. You're either absolutely going to love it or you're absolutely going to hate it. So I took that in consideration with where I did dock points. Overall, though, for me, I thought it was above average. It gets a 7 out of 10. That brings the total score on Silver City Brewery's Big Magnificent Bastard to an 82 out of 100. So I do think this is above average. If you're a fan of smoked beer or smoked Scotch, heavily peated with that earthy, smoky, roasty side, I think you'll probably enjoy this. If you're not, I would say steer clear. It definitely is not the beer for you. Moving on to number 2. This is Friem's Winter Ale. This one clocks in at 7.5% ABV. They are based out of Hood River, Oregon. Now, this was the first beer I'd had from this brewer, and I really enjoyed it. So starting off with the aroma. The aroma was nice. It wasn't exactly what I expected for a winter ale. I didn't pick up any winter spices, and it wasn't super pronounced, but it was above average. It gets a 6 out of 10. For the taste, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was very, very interesting. Most winter ales kind of fall into almost one size fits all. They're going to have a pretty standard malt bill, and they're going to have some winter spices, and some of them in the winter warmers, a little higher ABV and all that. But this was very different. This was very much its own animal, though it absolutely worked as a winter ale, and I really appreciated it. It had a very interesting mix of malt bills that just absolutely worked for this beer style, and frankly, it didn't need additives. It held its own. I only docked 1 point just for deviation's sake from the norm. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the body on this beer was not very big at all, really. I would say it was average. I did expect it to be more robust than it was. Even though 7.5 isn't that high of an ABV, it's not that low either. It just gets a 5 out of 10. For the mouthfeel. Mouthfeel on this beer was tremendous. It had a lot of resistance, and it had this really silky quality about it. And honestly, it was fantastic. A really great textbook example of a winter ale mouthfeel. Even the body wasn't there. The mouthfeel was. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish. Finish on this beer was exceptionally long. Far longer than your average winter ale, and far longer than I anticipated based on its appearance and what I was getting out of the beer. But really what I think helped do it was the hops. They really extended it out, and they were mild. I wouldn't call this a hoppy beer, but they were present enough you could taste the bitters, but that's what extended it. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the head and retention, just like the first beer, this one poured great at home. Nice, thick, lush, creamy head, held the whole time. Gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the appearance. The appearance threw me for a loop on this beer, and I thought it looked nice, but this is so far of a deviation from the norm that honestly, I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to bash it in points for that fact because I actually liked it, but it was quite a bit different than the norm. I decided to play the devil's advocate here and just give it above average because I think it worked as a total package. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was fantastic. And this was really all about the malts. It wasn't about gimmicks. It wasn't about additives. It was really all about the malt bill. And I absolutely loved how they put everything together. And the hops that they chose were also great and beautifully balanced. It gives a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Overall, I very much enjoyed this beer. Though I do have to say this is not your normal winter ale. They typically do have spices, and this one did not. They're typically darker. This one was not. They typically have a richer, heartier malt bill. This one didn't. Though what it did bring to the table, I really appreciated, and I did think it was well above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, is an example of the style. This was very much a dark horse in the winter ale game. It's a very unique beer in that it decided to go in a completely different direction, but overall it still brought the spirit of the beer style to the table. I did dock some points in a few categories that were pretty high, but overall I thought it was a strong showing, well above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. That brings the total score on Friem's Winter Ale to an 83 out of 100. So 82 and an 83, only 1 point apart in this review. Both distinctly different beers, that cater to distinctly different tastes, but I did enjoy them both immensely, and certainly take the information I've given to you. You make your decisions on which you would like to pick up. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can just click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.